The night was so still that even the crickets refused to sing. A foggy chill rolled across the pine woods of western Kentucky, carrying with it the distant thud of hooves. 27 of them. They moved in a slow, coordinated circle, their riders draped in dark coats instead of white sheets. Because these weren't ordinary raiders, these were Nightriders, men who preferred shadows over symbols, violence over words, and fear over law. Inside a small one-room cabin at the edge of the tree line, a single lantern burned. Its faint glow traced the silhouette of an aging man who wasn't supposed to be alive. Not after the war he'd survived. Not after the enemies he'd outshot. His name, whispered with bitterness by the men outside, was Elijah Creed. To most folks he was just a quiet black farmer living alone. But to the men tightening the circle around him, he was something far more dangerous. Because Elijah Creed had once been the Union's deadliest marksman. A battlefield ghost whose bullet always found its target. The army had given him medals. His enemies had given him nicknames. And now the Nightriders had given him a death sentence. As the horses stopped and the woods fell silent, Elijah reached under his cot and pulled out the long cloth-wrapped shape he swore he'd never touch again. The barrel still gleamed like a frozen river. His breath steadied, his eyes sharpened. The war for him had never truly ended. Tonight it was coming back to his doorstep, and the Nightriders had no idea that the man they came to kill was the same man who once picked off Confederate officers from half a mile away without missing even once. The night had a way of warning him before anything else did. Elijah Creed had lived long enough in these woods to understand the language of silence. Some nights were still because the world was resting, others were still because something was approaching. Tonight the stillness felt tight, stretched, unnatural. It pressed against the windows of his small cabin like a held breath. The lantern on the table flickered once as though reacting to something else. Elijah paused with his hands deep in a sack of cornmeal, listening with the same instinct that once saved him on battlefields nobody bothered writing about. The air carried a faint tremor too soft for most people to notice. But Elijah's ears had never forgotten the rhythm of danger. He stood motionless, letting the vibration roll across the soil and into the wooden frame beneath his feet. Hooves. Not one horse. Not two. Several. They weren't galloping wildly like travelers rushing home at night. They were in formation, moving with a grim purpose that reminded him of nights during the war when cavalry units rode behind enemy lines with every intention of leaving no survivors. Elijah pressed his hand against the rough table to steady himself. Not out of fear but out of recognition. He had felt this pattern before, decades ago, before the medals, before the scars, before the newspapers printed stories about a black sniper who never missed, back when he wasn't a farmer or a neighbor or a quietly aging veteran, but a weapon the Union kept pointing at the Confederacy. He moved to the window, careful not to let the lantern throw his shadow against the glass. The forest outside was a thick, lightless wall, but he didn't need to see the riders yet. He could hear the ground responding to them. The way roots absorbed the vibrations and passed them along. A man who had spent years listening for footsteps in trenches could interpret threats through the earth itself. His eyes narrowed. They were spreading out, splitting into arcs, surrounding, not passing. Elijah didn't curse or panic. He simply breathed out once, long and tired, as though some part of him had been expecting this night to arrive eventually. Peace wasn't something men like him were ever allowed to keep forever. He turned away from the window and walked across the small cabin, the floor creaking under his. A faint breeze slipped through a crack in the wall, brushing against his arm like a cold warning. The cabin was simple, just a cot, a table, a wood stove, and shelves lined with jars he filled each harvest season. It looked like the home of a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But the men outside already knew who lived here. They knew whose cabin they were circling. Elijah Creed had tried to bury his past beneath years of quiet work, early mornings, and modest living, but the past had claws, and some men had long memories filled with hatred. He paused by the stove, staring at the iron door glowing faintly red. His supper sat half-cooked inside, forgotten the moment the vibrations reached him. His heart didn't race. It set. His body, aged and worn but still holding the reflexes of the soldier he once was, knew exactly what this meant. Someone had finally come to collect a debt the world pretended wasn't owed anymore. Elijah reached for the lantern and dimmed the flame until only a small trembling glow remained. Darkness wrapped around the cabin's interior, allowing his eyes to adjust, allowing him to think. The hoofbeats grew clearer now, no longer distant murmurs but deliberate thuds. He counted them in his head without needing to speak. 7 on the east side, 5 by the creek, more behind the ridge. They weren't amateurs. They were coordinated, disciplined, patient. These weren't rowdy men seeking trouble for the night. These were Nightriders, men who operated in shadows, who preferred terror to conversation, who believed the Civil War never truly ended. Elijah had seen their work on other farms. He recognized the pattern well enough. They targeted men who fought in the Union, men who wore blue, Men who outlived things they weren't supposed to survive. He walked to the corner of the cabin, placing his palm against the wall. The vibrations intensified. They had stopped. The riders had taken their positions. They were waiting for a signal. Elijah inhaled deeply, the familiar scent of pine and old wood filling his lungs. His aging shoulder ached, a ghost of an injury from Shiloh where a bullet grazed him before he eliminated the officer who fired it. The ache wasn't pain. It was memory waking up. He looked around the cabin, scanning every corner, not for escape but for options. Outside, one of the horses snorted. A man whispered something harsh. Another rider cracked a branch under his boot. They thought they were being quiet, but Elijah's hearing had once detected enemy scouts crawling through mud beneath the cover of artillery. Their whispers might as well have been shouts. He stepped closer to the window again, letting the darkness inside the cabin cloak him. Between the trees he caught a glimpse of faint movement, shadows where there should have been only forest. Men were crouching, adjusting rifles, shifting in their saddle. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not panic but readiness, the same quiet, focused instinct that gripped him before every long-distance shot he ever took. He stood there silently, one hand resting against the windowsill, the other hanging loosely at his side. The night spoke again, not with voices but with a subtle shift in the air, a signal he had once learned to interpret long before he knew how to read or write. The circle was closing. Danger was not approaching. It had already arrived. The stillness outside broke just slightly as one rider in the shadows raised his arm, preparing to give the command that would shatter the peaceful life Elijah Creed had tried so long to build, unaware that the man in the cabin had already begun listening closely enough to predict exactly where the first move would come from. Earlier that evening, long before the hoofbeats reached Elijah Creed's cabin, a different kind of silence hung over an abandoned tobacco barn on the outskirts of town. It was a silence made of secrecy and tension. A silence thick enough to hide grudges that had survived decades. Inside the barn, lantern light flickered over the faces of 27 men, each one of them hardened by years of anger they never learned to let go of. Their horses were tied outside, shifting restlessly in the cold, as though sensing that whatever their riders planned tonight wouldn't end quietly. The men stood in a rough circle, their dark coats gathering dust, their boots sinking into the dried leaves scattered across the barn floor. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. Every man here had come with the same purpose, the same name on his mind, the same hatred simmering behind his eyes. At the center of the circle was Wade Kincannon, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar running from his jaw to his collarbone. The lantern light made the scar look like a white-hot slash of anger that never cooled. Wade wasn't just another night rider, he was their chosen leader, the man who convinced them all that the past could be rewritten if they carried enough guns. He stood with his hands clasped behind him, shifting his weight slowly, waiting for the room to grow still enough for his voice to carry. When he finally spoke, the men leaned in, drawn to the blunt authority in his tone. "You all know why we're here," Wade said, his words echoing faintly against the barn walls. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. He let it settle before continuing. "For years we've been cleaning this county of the filth left behind after the war. Most of them ran off, got scared, learned their place. But one man thinks he's too good to be taught." Wade paused, letting the anger simmer a little deeper in the room. Elijah Creed. The name hit the room like a stone dropped into water, silent, but the ripples were immediate. Some men clenched their fists, others shifted uncomfortably, remembering stories they had heard, or worse, stories they had lived through. Elijah Creed was a name that didn't fade easily. Even the younger men who hadn't fought in the war but grew up hearing their father's bitterness, swallowed hard at the sound of it. Wade could see the effect he was having, and he used it. "He shouldn't even be alive," Wade continued, pacing slowly. "He should have died on the battlefield like the rest of the bluecoat trash, but he didn't. No, he sat up in his little nest on the hills, picking off our officers like they were birds on a wire, his jaw tense. And then he disappeared after the war, thinking he could hide in these woods like we wouldn't remember, like we wouldn't pay him back." In the dim corner of the barn, an older man coughed, the sound dry and raspy. His name was Rowan Tate, a former Confederate sergeant who still walked with a limp from a bullet wound he swore Elijah Creed had inflicted. He leaned forward, resting his weight on a crooked cane. "He ain't just living out here," Rowan growled. "He's living free, and bold enough to stay on land that ought to belong to real men. Ain't right?" A few men nodded, muttering under their breath. They had convinced themselves long ago that justice was theirs to deliver, and Elijah Creed's existence was an insult to everything they believed they lost. The barn grew colder as the wind outside picked up, rattling loose boards and stirring dust in the air. Wade waited until the whispers quieted, then raised a gloved hand. "You all remember what he did," Wade said. "Some of you lost brothers because of him, fathers, friends, officers who would have led us to victory if he hadn't cut them down. He was the Union's pet sniper, The deadliest one they had, a monster with a rifle. He let the words sink in. And he lives right here, on our land, breathing our air. Land, that word always mattered to men like these. They clung to it like it could erase the defeat they never accepted. Wade knew how to use it like a blade. He thinks we don't know who he is, Wade said quietly, but we do. We've known for years. We waited, watched, made sure he didn't have anyone to protect him. He doesn't go into town. He doesn't have kin. No one checks on him. He made himself easy. A soft chuckle escaped one of the younger riders. A lanky man named Grady Boone. Easy? Heard he ain't touched a rifle since the war. Man probably forgot how to shoot. Rowan Tate's eyes snapped open, sharp as a knife. Don't fool yourself, boy. Once a man learns to kill from half a mile off, he don't ever forget. He's dangerous. Wade knows it. So do you. Don't act stupid tonight. Grady swallowed hard, the smirk fading from his face. The room shifted again as the weight of Rowan's words settled over the men. They had come prepared to kill, but they weren't dealing with an ordinary target. Wade finally stopped pacing and stood firm in the middle of the circle. Tonight, he said, we end what he started. We ride to his cabin, surround it, and make sure he understands he should have died with the rest of the bluecoats. He doesn't get to live out his days in peace while the men he shot are rotting in the ground. The men nodded, their breaths thickening in the cold air. Wade's voice dropped lower. No fire, he instructed. Not at first. We do this clean, quiet. We pull him out, make him kneel, make him answer for everything he did, for every officer he dropped, for every one of our men he sent to the dirt. A lantern sputtered, dimming slightly, as though reacting to the darkness in the room. The men turned toward the barn door where their horses waited outside. The night was growing darker, the chill sharper, the silence heavy. Wade stepped forward, and pushed the barn door open just enough to peer out at the moonless sky. The woods beyond were nothing but black silhouettes, the perfect cover for men who wanted to disappear after they did something unforgivable. He lowered the brim of his hat, satisfied with the moment. Mount up, he said, voice steady, controlled, certain. The men moved in unison, boots pounding the barn floor, the sound echoing like a warning the trees themselves didn't have time to heed. Horses snorted, hooves scraped the cold dirt, and one by one the Nightriders swung into their saddles. They formed a line, then a clustered mass, then a formation that looked practiced. Despite the years of silence between operations, 27 dark figures rode out into the night, fanning through the woods with an eerie discipline. Their goal was simple, their hatred was old, their confidence was unshaken, and none of them, not a single one, suspected that the man they were hunting was already listening for them, already reading the ground, already preparing for a night they thought they controlled. Elijah Creed's past didn't follow him like most men's memories did. It didn't whisper. It didn't sit quietly in his mind waiting to be recalled. It lived beneath his skin, carved into him like a second spine. And as the hoofbeats outside grew closer, as the night tightened around his cabin like a noose, the past began to stir again, encoiling itself slowly, reminding him of who he used to be and what he once carried in his hands with deadly certainty. Elijah had spent years trying to become just another face in the woods, a farmer no different from anyone else, tending his land with steady patience and keeping to himself. But a man who had been forged in war couldn't shed the steel inside him just because he wanted a quieter life. The people in town only knew Elijah as the reclusive black veteran who avoided crowds and didn't talk much. They never understood why he froze whenever he heard a gunshot echo from the hills, or why he always sat with his back to the wall when forced into a room with more than one doorway. They didn't know how many battles he'd watched unfold through the narrow view of a rifle scope. They didn't know the number of names he carried, the ones he whispered to himself at night when sleep refused him. The army had known his worth. The officers celebrated him, polished his medals, wrote reports about his miraculous marksmanship, and boasted about the man who could put a bullet through a Confederate's belt buckle at distances no other sniper dreamed of attempting. But none of those officers understood what Elijah had sacrificed to deliver those miracles. None of them knew how many times he had gone without sleep, waiting in silence on freezing hillsides, until dawn cracked the sky open. None of them knew the hours he spent lying in mud, slowing his own heartbeat so he could calculate the breath of a man half a mile away. They saw the medals, they never saw the cost. Elijah's reputation spread quickly during the war, even among the enemy. Confederate soldiers began referring to him indirectly, calling him the ghost on the ridge, the one who don't miss, or the shadow with blue eyes. Though Elijah's eyes were brown, rumors reshaped him into something super. Men started praying before crossing open fields, terrified the ghost might be watching from a tray line. Officers rode with their hats dipped low, darting their eyes to the hills every few seconds. Elijah took no pride in that fear. He was simply doing what he had been trained to do,
what he had been ordered to do, but the war made him into something else entirely. He could still remember the way his commanding officer, Captain Warren Maddox, first approached him after witnessing Elijah fire 3 quick shots in succession during a skirmish near the Tennessee River. Each shot had struck an enemy rifle barrel, bending the metal, and forcing the attackers to retreat. Maddox stared at him that day like he'd unearthed a weapon forged by God's own hands. "You ever work a long rifle before, Creed?" Maddox asked, but Elijah only shrugged. He had not until war forced him to. Maddox put a Whitworth rifle into his hands the next morning, and sent him up a ridge with orders to watch the valley. Elijah didn't know what he was supposed to be looking for at first, but war had a way of teaching quickly, brutally, effectively. On his first day as a designated marksman, he spotted a Confederate officer lifting a spyglass to survey the Union line. Elijah watched the man for a full minute, studying the way he adjusted his coat, the rhythm of his breath, the slight shake in his hand. Elijah felt the wind brushing against the back of his neck, counted the seconds between the man's inhale and exhale, adjusted his aim just a fraction, then squeezed the trigger. The officer dropped instantly. Maddox didn't praise him. He simply nodded, like he knew Elijah was made for this long before Elijah did. After that day, Elijah became the eyes of the regiment. They trusted him more than their maps. Soldiers asked him to scan forests before they marched. Scouts depended on his instinct. Officers counted on him to remove threats before they even reached the battlefield. And with each mission, Elijah learned to read distances like they were printed words. He learned to calculate wind based on how leaves trembled. He learned to slow his pulse until it matched the world around. But for every shot he took, for every officer he dropped, Elijah felt a weight growing inside his chest. He kept count, not because anyone asked him to, but because he couldn't bear the thought of forgetting. Every man he shot had a name, a family, a life beyond the war. Elijah didn't know their stories, but he imagined them anyway. It was the only way to keep from becoming the monster the Confederates whispered about. Yet some nights, when the war stretched on endlessly, Elijah wondered if he was becoming exactly what they feared. He saw how other men in the regiment looked at him, not with admiration, but with unease. There was something unnatural about a man who could fire once, and hit exactly where he intended every single time. When the war finally ended, Elijah walked away without ceremony. He kept his medals in a wooden box he never opened. The army offered him a career, a higher rank, a chance to keep using the skills they had sharpened. Elijah declined. All he wanted was a place where silence meant peace, not danger, a place where he could plant crops instead of fear. He found this cabin. He rebuilt it board by board. He grew corn, beans, collards. He listened to the wind instead of distant artillery. For a while he thought he had outrun the ghost they turned him into. But men like Wade Kincannon and Rowan Tate never forgot the war in the same way Elijah tried to. They remembered every officer Elijah had dropped. They remembered every ambush he ruined. They remembered the shame of being out-earned, outmatched, outshot by a black man who fought with a precision that felt impossible. To them Elijah represented a chapter of the war they couldn't swallow, a chapter they believed needed rewriting with blood. Elijah didn't know the details of their hatred. He didn't need to. He had seen enough in their eyes years ago, back when he spared Wade Kincannon, on a day when the war felt like it might shift in the Confederates' favor. He hadn't taken that He remembered lowering his rifle, deciding that killing another man wouldn't change anything. Wade remembered it too, but in a different way, not as mercy, but as humiliation. Outside the cabin, the hoofbeats stopped completely. Elijah stood in the dim light of his lantern, the shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. His past wasn't knocking on his door tonight, it was surrounding him, tightening around the cabin like a memory turned into flesh and bone. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything he'd lived through settle inside him, not as burden this time, but as clarity. The ghost of the ridge, the Union's deadliest marksman, the man they thought had buried himself in these woods. He could feel all of it rising, unfolding, awakening. And as the riders shifted outside, he knew the life he had tried to build was already slipping away, replaced by the version of himself he never wanted to meet again.
The reason the Nightriders wanted Elijah Creed dead did not begin tonight, nor did it begin with whispers in the dark woods, or secret meetings in a tobacco barn. It began decades earlier on a battlefield soaked in mud and fear, during a moment none of the men involved ever fully forgot. Wars create wounds that never close, but this one was different. This was a wound that festered because it mixed humiliation, loss, pride, and the one thing that burned hotter than defeat: memory. Elijah himself hadn't expected the past to follow him this far, but while he tried to bury the war beneath years of quiet living, the men forming a circle outside his cabin carried the war inside them like a second heartbeat. They had been waiting for this night longer than Elijah ever realized. It started with a single shot fired in the late afternoon sun during the siege of Franklin. Elijah had been positioned on a ridge overlooking the Confederate advance, his Whitworth rifle steady against the ground, his breath slow, his focus sharpened into a razor's edge. From his vantage point he'd watched as Confederate officers regrouped behind a stone wall preparing to make another push. Among them was Colonel Silas Kincannon, a respected officer known for leading charges with a kind of reckless confidence that made his men believe he couldn't die. Silas was the elder brother of Wade Kincannon, a man who idolized him, followed him into the war and believed every word Silas ever spoke about honor and fate. Elijah had watched the colonel lift his field glass and signal toward the left flank. He didn't want to pull the trigger even though it was his duty. He hesitated a moment too long, hoping the colonel would step behind cover, hoping there would be another way to break the Confederate push. But orders came through runner. Drop the officer. Stop the advance. Elijah exhaled, adjusted for the breeze rolling off the ridge, and squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed across the field. Colonel Silas Kincannon fell. That single shot changed more than the course of the battle. It carved Elijah's name directly into the hatred of 27 Confederate soldiers, many of whom had followed Silas through hell and back. Some of those men were now outside Elijah's cabin. But that wasn't the only reason. A second incident sealed Elijah's fate, one that Wade Kincannon remembered with a bitterness so deep it reshaped his entire life. Weeks after Silas's death, near Chattanooga, Wade had taken command of a small scouting party. They were moving through dense forest when Elijah spotted them from half a mile away. His orders were simple: disrupt the scouts, send them scrambling. Elijah took aim at Wade, his finger pressing lightly against the trigger, but then he saw something in Wade's face. Exhaustion, fear, the kind of despair that made men look older than they truly were. Elijah lowered his rifle. He let Wade live. Wade never forgot that moment. He never forgot the humiliation of being spared like a child too insignificant to finish off. In Wade's mind, Elijah hadn't shown mercy. He had shown arrogance. He had looked down the barrel of his rifle, measured Wade's worth, and dismissed him as unworthy of the bullet. That decision burned itself into Wade's pride so deeply that every time he closed his eyes he saw Elijah's calm expression behind the scope, deciding his fate. Pride like Wade's couldn't tolerate being spared by the man who killed his brother. When the war ended, most men returned home with empty pockets and exhausted souls. But Wade returned home with a mission. He gathered men who had lost fathers, brothers, cousins, men who had etched the name Creed into the darker corners of their memory. Some blamed Elijah for disrupting troop movements that cost them battles. Others blamed him for shots he didn't take, but they believed he might have. Rumor had given Elijah supernatural abilities, transforming him into a phantom tormentor who never met. Every Confederate loss in which a long-distance shot played a role became, in their minds, another tally under his name. Still, hatred alone wasn't enough to bring 27 men to his doorstep. What pushed them over the edge happened after the war. In the years following emancipation, Elijah had used a portion of his Union pay to purchase land legally, 5 acres near the woods, a place where he could rebuild a life without looking over his shoulder. But the land had once belonged to the Tate family, specifically, Rowan Tate's cousin, who died in the war and left the property abandoned. Rowan believed no black man had the right to own it, even if Elijah purchased it cleanly from the county. Rowan spread the story that Elijah stole the land. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the humiliation of seeing the land his family once rode across now plowed by a man he considered unworthy of touching it. Every harvest Elijah pulled from that soil was another insult. Over time, these grudges, Silas's death, Wade's humiliation, Rowan's bitterness, the war's memory began merging into a single narrative. The Nightriders used to justify their hatred. They told themselves Elijah had stolen lives, land, pride, legacy. They convinced their sons and neighbors that Elijah Creed was not merely a veteran, but a living reminder that they lost a war they believed should have been theirs. But there was one more detail, a secret the Nightriders never spoke aloud but each knew privately. During the war, Elijah had not only dropped enemy officers, he had disrupted the communications between Confederate regiments during one of the final pushes near Nashville. Many Confederate troops were left scattered, leaderless, and exposed. Some died in the confusion, others were captured. A few never made it home at all. Families across the county remembered that day. They remembered hearing whispers that a black Union sniper had single-handedly scattered entire units from the hills. It didn't matter whether the rumors were fully true, they believed them. Belief was enough. And now, decades later, they stood outside Elijah's cabin, because they believed ending his life would fix something in their own. Inside, Elijah didn't know the full details of their hatred, but he understood enough. He could feel it in the way the hoofbeats moved. He could sense it in the silence settling outside. He could hear it in the rustle of men shifting into position. determined, disciplined, convinced they were carrying out justice. Elijah had spent years trying to forget the war, but the men surrounding his cabin had spent those same years sharpening their anger like knives. They believed Elijah's death would rewrite the ending of the war they never accepted. They believed killing him would restore something lost. They believed, fiercely, dangerously, that the man who had taken so much from them could be erased, and with him, the shame they carried. All of it, every moment, every grudge, every whisper had brought them to this night, to this forest, to the edges of Elijah Creed's quiet life. And in their minds the reason was simple and unforgivable. Elijah Creed had survived the war, they had not. The tension in the cabin thickened the moment Ruth stepped forward, her footsteps soft but carrying the weight of something neither the others nor the overseer could easily name. The lantern light flickered across her face, catching the determined set in her jaw, and the fire simmering inside her eyes, a fire that had always been there but that no one had dared acknowledge aloud. The others watched her in silence, some with worry, some with awe, and some with the growing realization that what was happening in this moment might be the turning point they had all quietly prayed for, even if none of them had ever spoken such prayer. Ruth didn't look at any of them. Her gaze was fixed on the window, on the darkness outside, on the faint rustle of movement she sensed in the woods, as if the night itself was trying to warn her or urge her on. She had always been known for the strange calm she carried, a calm that didn't come from fear or submission like so many believed, but from calculation. She had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to watch everything, remember everything, and pretend to be harmless, pretend to be predictable, pretend to be like everyone else expected. But tonight she wasn't pretending. The events of the day had scraped away too much, exposed too much, and the things she had been burying inside her were no longer content to stay silent. She moved toward the door, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight, and for a moment the others seemed frozen in place, unsure whether to follow, to call out, or to remain still and pray that she knew what she was doing, because they certainly didn't. Outside, the air carried a heavy stillness, the kind that always hung before something important happened. The moon was faint behind the clouds, offering only a thin wash of light that made the trees seem taller, the path narrower, the shadows deeper. Ruth stepped out onto the hard-packed dirt, her breath forming a small cloud as she exhaled. Each step she took was deliberate, her senses sharpened, her heartbeat steady, even though every instinct inside her screamed that tonight could tip everything in the wrong direction, if she made even the smallest mistake. But she also knew that doing nothing would be worse. Doing nothing would let the danger inch closer, let the overseer's cruelty tighten its grip, let the fear swallow them one by one. She had seen too much suffering, too many nights of whispered dread, too many mornings where someone else didn't come back from the field. She wasn't going to wait for the next tragedy to happen. Inside the cabin, whispers rose behind her, short and frightened like the fluttering of trapped birds. They weren't just worried about her, they were worried about what her actions might stir, what consequences might crash down upon all of them if the overseer or the master learned that someone dared to move without permission. But at the same time there was a spark among them, a tiny dangerous hope. Ruth had always been different. She spoke less, but she observed more. She endured more than most, yet she broke less off. She collected details, every guard's habits, every shift change, every weakness in the fences, every moment when the watchful eyes looked away. Some thought it was simply her way of coping. Now they were realizing it might have been preparation. As Ruth neared the edge of the clearing, she paused behind the large oak tree, its branches spreading out like a shield above her. She listened carefully, pressing her palm against the rough bark, grounding herself as she strained to catch the faint sounds that had drawn her attention early. She heard leaves brushing against one another, the soft snap of a twig, the faint hush of a breath. Someone was out there, hiding, waiting, watching. She didn't call out. She didn't challenge. She simply stood still, letting the night reveal what it wanted to reveal. Her instincts told her she wasn't dealing with danger from the outside. Not yet. Whoever was there wasn't approaching with confidence or aggression. Their presence felt cautious, uncertain, almost desperate. She shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing, and for a moment the moon broke through the clouds just enough to cast a faint glow across the underbrush. That was when she saw a young man emerging slowly from the shadows, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt, his breath ragged from running. But it wasn't his appearance that struck her, it was his expression. He looked at her with a mixture of fear and recognition, as if he had been searching specifically for her and had prayed she would be the one to find him. Ruth felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that whatever had happened to him out there was connected to the growing tension that had been building on the plantation for weeks. He took another step forward, keeping his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm, and Ruth's gaze swept over him, noting every detail, his trembling fingers, the cut on his cheek,
The way he kept glancing behind him as if expecting someone to burst out of the woods at any moment. She didn't speak. She let him gather the courage to say whatever he had come to say, because she knew forcing him to speak too soon might break him. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from fear and exhaustion, and the words that tumbled out were enough to wrench the air right out of her lungs. He told her what he had seen on the road, what he had overheard, what was coming their way before dawn. As he spoke, Ruth felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like an iron yoke, but she didn't flinch. She had suspected something was coming, had felt the pressure building, but hearing the truth aloud made everything sharper, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. When he finished, he looked at her with eyes that pleaded for direction, for assurance, for anything that resembled safety. Ruth didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer fear either. She simply stepped closer, her mind already racing through possibilities, strategies, and choices, each one more dangerous than the last, but all of them better than standing still. The young man watched her, waiting for her reaction, waiting for her decision, waiting for the moment where she would either step back into the cabin and warn the others, or decide to face what was coming alone. And the air around them tightened as the first distant echo of footsteps began drifting through the trees, growing louder with every passing second, signaling that whatever time they thought they had was already slipping away and that the moment to act had arrived, whether they were ready or not. The argument inside the cabin rose so suddenly and so sharply that it rattled even the strongest ones among them. It started with a single voice, low, tense, already trembling with fear, but once the words spilled out, they spread like sparks catching dry timber. Within seconds the tight, dim room filled with clashing opinions, whispered fears, turning into full-throated panic. The lantern swung slightly from its hook as bodies shifted, as people stood, gestured, paced, all of them trying desperately to make sense of what Ruth had done, what the stranger's warning meant and what they were supposed to do now. The children huddled near the corner, their eyes wide, following every raised voice and trembling movement, sensing the danger even if they didn't understand the detail. Isaac, the oldest among them, tried to silence the chaos with a raised hand, but tonight no one was willing to bow to the old rhythms of obedience, not because they didn't respect him, but because fear had bitten too deeply, and the situation felt bigger than anything they had faced before. A tall woman near the hearth grabbed the edge of the table as if steadying herself, her voice cracking as she insisted that staying put would only make them sitting target. Another argued that running into the woods in the middle of the night was nothing but suicide, especially if armed men were already on their way. Someone else hissed that maybe the boy Ruth brought in was lying or mistaken, or simply too terrified to tell the story right, and that acting on uncertain information might doom them faster than standing still. Ruth stood near the doorway, silent, watching all of it unfold with an unreadable expression. She didn't try to argue with them. She didn't try to interrupt. She let them vent their fear, let the panic burn itself louder and hotter, because she understood something no one else did. This explosion had been simmering for months. Everyone had been stretched thin by long hours, harsh punishments, missing people, and the quiet creeping dread that something violent was brewing behind the master's polite facade. Tonight's news hadn't caused this panic. It had only cracked the thin shell that had kept it contained. The young man she had brought in sat on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, his hands still shaking. He tried to speak again, tried to repeat what he had overheard, but his voice kept breaking under the weight of fear. Some of them ignored him entirely, too wrapped in their own terror to listen, while others glared at him as if he embodied the danger itself. Ruth watched him carefully. She could see he was close to collapsing, not from exhaustion alone, but from the guilt pressing down on him. He hadn't meant to bring chaos into their home. He had only meant to warn them before it was too late. When Isaac finally managed to shout loud enough to freeze the room, the silence that followed was jagged, fragile, full of heavy breathing and quivering lips. Everyone turned toward him, their faces etched with worry, resentment, confusion, and a desperation that was beginning to twist into something close to hopelessness. Isaac looked at Ruth, his stare firm but questioning, silently demanding that she share everything she knew, everything she believed they needed to hear. But Ruth didn't speak. She had already made her position clear by bringing the fleeing boy into their space, and she knew that any words she added now would only feed the fire rather than calm it. The cabin's walls seemed to shrink as the quiet dragged on. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. Someone else wiped their eyes quickly before anyone could see. The floorboards creaked under anxious shifting as people waited for anyone to say something that felt like direction. That was when Micah, the one who rarely spoke and almost never disagreed with Isaac, stepped forward. His hands were clenched so tightly, his knuckles had turned pale, but his voice, though shaky, carried enough resolve to slice the silence in half. He argued that running wasn't the only choice and hiding wasn't the only choice either. There were ways to outsmart the men ways to create confusion, ways to buy time. People turned to him, some hopeful, some skeptical, all still trembling inside the storm of fear that hadn't yet spent itself. Micah continued talking, outlining things he'd noticed in the past weeks. A wagon with a loose wheel the overseer relied on, a blind spot near the smokehouse where patrols never looked, a predictable rotation of the guards at night. He spoke like someone who had been collecting these observations for a long time, the same way Ruth collected details, storing them quietly because someday they might matter. Tonight they mattered more than anyone could have predicted. But before Micah could finish, someone near the back interrupted sharply, demanding to know what the point was. How could anyone fight men with guns, men with authority, men who wouldn't hesitate to burn the entire cabin if they believed someone inside was responsible for defiance, or sheltering a runaway? The argument reignited instantly, hotter than before. Insults slipped into the accusations, crackled like lightning. A woman burst into tears. A man slammed his fist against the table hard enough to rattle the plates. The young man on the bed flinched with every loud noise, as if expecting someone to grab him and drag him outside as an offering to the approaching danger. Ruth stepped forward, not to speak but simply to stand between the people who seemed closest to lunging at each other. Her presence alone made some of them pause, not because she was stronger, but because they understood something about her. Ruth did not lose control, ever. Her calm, even now, was unnerving, and in that moment the contrast between her steadiness and their panic made several of them stop long enough to catch their breath. The lantern flickered again, shadows dancing across their faces, highlighting the bruises, the scars, the exhaustion carved into each of them. Another voice spoke from near the hearth, weaker this time, suggesting that maybe they should send the boy away and pretend they had never seen him. The room split at once. Some nodded, desperate for a way to avoid punishment. Others recoiled, horrified at the idea of condemning someone to certain death, just to save themselves. A heated exchange erupted, voices rising over one another until words blurred into noise. The boy lowered his head, tears sliding silently down his dirt-streaked cheeks, his breath trembling as he realized that his fate was being weighed like a burden rather than a life worth protecting. Ruth's jaw tightened. For the first time since returning to the cabin, something flickered in her eyes, a spark of anger, fierce and cutting, breaking through the mask she usually kept in place. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten, she simply turned toward the group and let the weight of her stare press into the room. One by one, people quieted under that gaze, not because they feared her, but because they remembered everything she had done for them in small, quiet ways over the years. Ruth had never abandoned anyone. She had never betrayed anyone. She had never surrendered anyone to the overseer, even when doing so would have spared her punishment. Her principles were sharper than most people's tempers, and everyone in the cabin knew it. The room fell still again, breaths shallow, minds racing, hearts pounding hard enough to shake ribs. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, a soft, eerie reminder that the outside world was creeping closer with every passing second. In the distance, faint but growing clear, came the unmistakable sound of horses moving along the dirt path, their hooves muffled but steady, a sound that made several heads snap toward the window in sudden terror, as the arguments died on their tongues, and the air inside the cabin tightened, all at once, as everyone realized just how little time they had left to decide anything at all.
The knock on the door came so soft at first that Elijah almost mistook it for the shifting of old wood, the natural groan of a cabin bracing against the cool night air. But the sound came again, deliberate, hesitant, trembling in a way that no wind could imitate. Elijah froze where he stood, one hand hovering near the lantern's base, the other slowly closing into a fist as he tilted his head, listening. It wasn't the pounding of a mob or the confident rap of a neighbor stopping by. It was the sound of someone who didn't want to knock but had forced themselves to anyway. Someone afraid of being heard and even more afraid of being ignored. Elijah's breath deepened, his ears narrowing in on every tiny vibration echoing from the wooden door, his entire body slipping back into the trained stillness that had kept him alive through years of Confederate ambushes. The knock came a third time, barely more than a whisper against the frame, followed by a sharp exhale on the other side as if the visitor had run all the way here and was trying desperately to keep quiet. Elijah didn't move immediately. He had learned a long time ago that rushing toward unknown sounds was a fool's instinct. Instead, he stepped silently away from the lantern, letting the darkness swallow him, letting his pupils widen until he could see every contour of the room perfectly. He waited. Listen. The person outside shifted their weight, the faint crunch of gravel signaling a foot dragging nervously. It wasn't the sound of someone preparing to attack. It was the sound of someone exhausted, terrified, and alone. Only then did Elijah approach the door, every step controlled, deliberate. His boots barely made a sound on the creaking floorboards. When he reached the entrance, he didn't unbolt it yet. He pressed one palm flat against the wood, feeling for vibration. The trembling was small but unmistakable. It carried the energy of a person who had run until their legs nearly gave out. Elijah lowered his fingers to the latch, sliding it open with such slow precision that even the metal seemed to hold its breath. He cracked the door just enough for a sliver of moonlight to spill inside. A figure stumbled forward into view, illuminated only in fragments. The curve of a cheek streaked with sweat, the glint of wide eyes overflowing with panic, the outline of a rifle case clutched tightly against a trembling chest. It wasn't until Elijah opened the door a bit wider that the full shape of the man appeared. A boy barely in his 20s, face pale, lips trembling, shirt torn where branches or hands had clawed at it during a desperate escape. His knees buckled the moment he saw Elijah clearly, as if something in him finally let go at the sight of a familiar silhouette. "Sir, please," the boy whispered, his voice broken with exhaustion and fear. "They're coming. They're behind me. I didn't know where else to go." Elijah recognized him instantly, not by name but by type. He had seen that face on countless young soldiers during the war, boys who had been pushed past their limits, who carried terror like a weight strapped to their bone. He stepped back, allowing the boy inside, shutting the door behind him with a soft thud that echoed like a heartbeat. The boy practically collapsed against the wall, breathing in sharp, uneven gasps. Elijah didn't rush him for answers. He walked to the table, lit the lantern just enough to cast a low, warm glow, then returned with a tin cup of water. The boy took it with shaking hands, spilling some on the floor before finally managing a sip. His gaze darted repeatedly toward the windows, his shoulders jumping with every distant sound outside, no matter how small. Elijah recognized that look too, the look of someone who believed death was only seconds behind him. "They saw me," the boy finally blurted out, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I wasn't supposed to be there. I was just passing through, I swear it. But I heard them. I heard what they said about you, what they planned. I didn't know who else would help. I didn't know where else to run. You're the only one they're afraid of." His words tumbled over one another, breathless, panicked, desperate to spill out before time ran out. Elijah didn't interrupt. He let the boy empty his fear, let the words pour like water from a cracked barrel. "They said they had 27 men," the boy continued, lowering his voice until it quivered like thin glass. 27 Nightriders, all armed, all heading this way. They said you couldn't hide forever, said the war didn't end for them, said tonight they were going to finish what their daddies never got the chance to. His breath shuddered. "I wasn't supposed to hear that. They saw me. They chased me halfway through the woods. If I hadn't run when I did, I'd already be dead." His voice broke, choked with fear, and he pressed both hands over his face as if trying to block out the images still flooding his mind. Elijah stepped back, studying him carefully, memorizing every detail, the scrapes on his arms, the raw red marks around his wrists, the dirt ground into his knees, the sting of branches carved into his skin. This wasn't a boy lying to gain shelter. This was someone who had truly run for his life, someone who had risked even more by coming here. The old sniper knelt beside the boy, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer pity. He simply rested one hand on the boy's shoulder, a steady, grounding weight that brought the young man's trembling down by a fraction. Elijah spoke only once. The boy's breathing had slowed enough for him to listen. "Tell me exactly how far behind you they were." The boy swallowed hard. "Close. I could still hear them when I crossed the ridge. I think they were splitting. I think some of them circled the creek. I don't know if they followed my tracks all the way, but they know the direction I ran. They know I headed toward your land." Elijah's eyes narrowed. That meant the riders weren't scattered or disorganized. They had been tracking methodic. They were intentional, focused. This wasn't drunken chaos, it was a hunt. And Elijah knew men like that didn't abandon a chase until blood stained the ground. The boy leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper that shook from the inside out. They weren't talking like men planning a warning or a scare. They were talking like men planning a killing. A clean one. A fast one. The kind they've done before. He pulled in a trembling breath. "They talked about you, about how many you killed during the war, about how they needed more than a dozen men to take down one old sniper. They were scared of you, sir. Angry but scared." Elijah didn't flinch. He had been called many things over the years: soldier, killer, hero, monster. But none of them mattered now. The only thing that mattered was what the boy confirmed next, his voice cracking as the truth finally came out. "They said you were the Union's deadliest shot, and that tonight they were going to make sure you never lived long enough to fire another round. Elijah moved through the cabin with a quietness that seemed impossible for a man his size, his shadow gliding across the wooden floor as if it belonged to someone half his weight. He didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't show even a flicker of panic. The boy watched him from the chair near the wall, still trembling, still clutching his arms as though trying to hold himself together. What unsettled him more than the danger outside was Elijah's calm. It wasn't the calm of someone unaware. It was the calm of someone who had been here before, who had stood in the middle of death and survived, who understood fear so deeply that it no longer ruled him. The air inside the cabin seemed to tighten around that calm, like the room itself leaned closer to listen. Elijah stopped at the far corner and reached beneath a loose floorboard. The wood lifted with a soft scrape, revealing a hollow space packed with oiled cloth, metal fittings and bundles wrapped tight with twine. For years he had kept this hidden, not because he feared discovery, but because he hoped he would never need what lay inside again. But hope was a fragile thing, and tonight, it had been stripped away like bark peeled from a tree. He unwrapped the cloth with practiced movements, revealing the long dark frame of a rifle that seemed to hold its own weight in silence. The boy's breath hit, even disassembled. The weapon had a presence, a cold, lethal beauty carved out of steel and memory. Elijah laid the pieces on the table, each one fitting into place with gentle precision. He didn't slam anything, didn't load anything loudly, didn't treat the weapon like a show of strength. His hands moved like a craftsman, restoring something sacred. The boy wiped his palms on his knees, unable to stop staring. He had heard stories about the rifle, about how it had ended men from distances they hadn't believed a bullet could travel. But seeing it in the hands of the man who had earned those stories made the air feel heavier. "You kept it all these years," the boy whispered, his voice still cracking. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He inspected the barrel in the lantern's dim glow, checking for dust, oil, residue. His expression didn't change, but the boy sensed something unspoken in the way Elijah handled the weapon, a memory he had never shared, a weight he carried alone. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice low and steady, a voice sharpened by experience rather than anger. "A man doesn't throw away the only thing that kept him alive." The boy swallowed hard, nodding as if he understood, though he didn't fully. No one who hadn't lived through those battlefields could ever understand what it meant to keep a weapon not for violence, but for survival. Elijah attached the scope next, tightening the small brass screws with a tool that looked older than half the country. Each movement was deliberate. It was as if the rifle remembered him too, as if the two were reconnecting after years of silence. Outside, the night shifted, a branch snapping, an owl taking flight, a breeze carrying the faintest scent of horse sweat. Elijah paused, lifting his head slightly. "Listen." The boy heard nothing, but Elijah's eyes narrowed. He returned to assembling the rifle, without needing to say what he already knew. The riders were closer. Time was thinning. The boy rose from the chair, his legs still weak but driven by some instinct to be useful. "Can I help?" he asked softly, though fear trembled through every word. Elijah studied him for a long moment, not judging, not dismissing, just measuring. Then he shook his head once, not unkindly, but firmly. "You've already helped by getting here alive." His tone held no arrogance, only truth. The boy wasn't trained. His hands shook too much, his breathing was too uneven. Elijah knew the burden of responsibility, and he wasn't about to place it on someone already half broken. He reached for a small velvet pouch and poured a few rounds into his palm, each one polished, heavy, carved with faint notches that only Elijah knew the meaning of. The boy watched him load them into the chamber with a soft metallic click that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Elijah closed the rifle with the same careful pressure a man might use on a fragile lock. When he stood, the rifle balanced in his hands. The boy could suddenly imagine the man Elijah had been decades ago, the ghost-like figure on ridge tops, the shadow behind enemy lines, the sniper, whose name had burned through Confederate camps like a whispered play. He set the rifle gently on the table, then reached for the smaller revolver strapped beneath the bench. That one he checked quickly but thoroughly, flicking the cylinder with a smooth rotation. The boy's throat tight. Something about watching Elijah prepare for battle in this quiet, intimate space felt unreal, like a story unraveling itself in real time. You think they'll attack right away?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible. Elijah didn't look up from the revolver. "Men who ride in the dark don't ride for conversation." His tone wasn't grim. It was factual. He holstered the weapon and then walked to the window, parting the curtain with just enough space to scan the tree line without revealing himself.
His eyes adjusted instantly, mapping every shadow, every gap between trunks, every flicker of movement that didn't belong. The boy watched the muscles in Elijah's jaw tighten slightly. That was the only sign that he saw something concerning. "They're taking positions," Elijah murmured, almost to himself. "Not all together. They're spreading, trying to box the place in." He let the curtain fall back into place. "They know better than to rush me on open ground." The boy's heart skipped. "You mean they've fought men like you before?" Elijah gave a faint exhale. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sigh. "No one's fought men like me. But they've heard the stories. That's enough to make them cautious." He returned to the table and picked up the rifle, running his thumb lightly along the barrel as if reacquainting himself with the weight of his own history. The boy stepped closer, not out of bravery but because distance suddenly felt The cabin felt smaller, the lantern dimmer, the world outside too full of things with teeth. Elijah knelt at the foot of his bed and pulled out a wooden box etched with initials so worn they were nearly unreadable. When he opened it, the soft clink of metal revealed rows of tools, scopes, cloth, and a folded strip of blue fabric with faded stars that the boy immediately recognized. Elijah didn't touch the cloth. He simply closed the box halfway, leaving it visible but untouched, as if acknowledging its presence without letting memory drag him backward. He returned the tools he didn't need, then stood again, rifle in hand. The boy felt the air shift slightly around him, like standing near a storm gathering strength. Elijah's posture straightened, his shoulders settling into an old familiar alignment. Every line of tension in his body transformed into focus. His breathing slowed, deepened, his eyes sharpened, until they no longer looked like the eyes of a farmer or a recluse. They looked like the eyes of a man who could hit a target no one else could even see. "What do we do now?" the boy whispered. Elijah lifted the rifle, checking the sight one last time, the lens catching a glint of lantern light like an awakening. "The first thing we do," he said quietly, "is make sure they don't choose how this night begins." The sounds outside had changed now, subtle but unmistakable. The night no longer held the soft rhythm of wind in the trees or the quiet murmurs of wildlife. Each snap of a twig, each low crunch of gravel, each faint rustle of leaves, carried a weight that made the boy flinch and Elijah's muscles tighten in silent recognition. He moved toward the window again, leaning just enough to peer into the shadows without revealing himself, and immediately noticed the difference. The Nightriders were forming small groups, spreading around the perimeter, communicating with soft hushed signals that even in the darkness betrayed coordination. They weren't reckless, they weren't panicked, they were calculating. They had studied him, or at least they thought they had, and now they were testing the boundaries, seeing how close they could get before the first warning came. Elijah crouched slightly, his hands resting lightly on the rifle, feeling its familiar weight settle against his forearm, like an extension of himself. Every instinct he had honed during years of skirmishes and long-range confrontations surged into focus. His eyes scanned the line of trees, counting the spaces, judging distances, noting where moonlight might strike metal, imagining every possible path a man could take if he tried to close in too quickly. The boy shifted behind him, barely daring to breathe, and Elijah didn't turn. He didn't need to. The boy was already sensing the same tension, the same weight of anticipation that hung in the air. "They're circling," Elijah murmured, almost to himself. His voice was low, a hushed vibration that somehow cut through the fear like a blade through cloth. "They're trying to find a weakness, a blind spot. Men like that always look for patterns, for the place where someone thinks they're safe." He slid the rifle closer to his shoulder, still unmounted but ready, each movement deliberate and economical. "But I don't make mistakes, and I never wait for them to find me." The boy swallowed hard, realizing that he was witnessing not a man preparing for defense, but a predator getting ready to strike. A predator who had already lived through countless nights where survival depended on patience and precision. What should we do?" he whispered again, but the question sounded hollow even to him. He already felt the answer forming in Elijah's silence, the same answer that had kept him alive through a war and made him the Union's deadliest sniper. Elijah moved back from the window and began to adjust small details inside the cabin. He moved chairs slightly to block sight lines, shifted a small table near the doorway to create a subtle obstacle, and stacked a few loose firewood logs in positions that might delay anyone entering quickly. These were not haphazard actions. They were deliberate, methodical, part of a mental map he had already drawn in his mind, anticipating every possible approach the riders might take. He crouched near the hearth for a moment, pressing an ear to the floor to catch faint vibrations that might indicate movement outside, then straightened and nodded slightly, as if confirming what he had already suspected. They were close enough to see shadows, close enough to feel the night around them, but not yet close enough to know what awaited. The boy moved again, trembling slightly. "Sir, if they see us, if they..." His voice faltered and he pressed a hand over his mouth, as if the words themselves could call danger inside. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He only placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, firm and grounding, a signal to remain still and focus. He didn't speak because words were unnecessary. The air already carried enough tension, enough understanding between the two that explanation was superfluous. Survival wasn't about conversation, it was about observation, anticipation and timing. Elijah returned to the rifle, assembling it fully now, snapping the pieces together with precision born of repetition, muscle memory and countless hours alone in the field. He checked the sight, adjusted the stock, ran his fingers lightly over the trigger guard. Each motion was deliberate but fluid, like a dance he had practiced 1,000 times. The boy watched enraptured and terrified, knowing instinctively that every movement counted, that even the slightest error could turn the night into a trap. A low sound outside made Elijah pause. He held his breath and listened. The horse's hooves had shifted slightly, the soft crunch of gravel changing rhythm, distant voices murmuring under breath. They weren't just approaching, they were probing, testing, moving in coordinated steps designed to measure response. Elijah's eyes narrowed, focusing on the faintest outlines of movement beyond the clearing, tracing paths between trees where shadows deepened unnaturally. He could see the angles they were taking, and he calculated silently where he could intercept, where a single well-placed shot might create confusion, hesitation, and ultimately give him the upper hand. The boy's voice was barely audible. "They're going to come in numbers. 27, you said?" His words trembled. Is it even possible?" Elijah didn't answer directly. He only tightened his grip on the rifle, and adjusted his position slightly, ensuring he could move quickly, remain unseen and strike where necessary. "Numbers mean nothing if they underestimate you," he said finally, his voice steady, precise. "They think they can scare me with size and force. They don't know patience, calculation and skill. That's what keeps a man alive." He paused, letting the words sink into the boy's mind, not as reassurance, not as boasting, but as a statement of fact, a lesson in survival under impossible odds. The first flash of movement caught Elijah's eye, a shadow slipping between two trunks, a horse shifting slightly in the brush, a faint glint that reflected the lantern light from metal strapped to a rider's hip. He moved to the window again, careful, calculating the angle. He adjusted the rifle slightly, aligning it with the path he knew one of them would take. His breathing slowed deliberately, each inhalation measured, each exhalation controlled. Years of experience told him that the first shot would determine everything. It wasn't just the kill, it wasn't just the warning, it was the signal, the moment that the hunters became the hunted. The boy crouched lower, trying not to make a sound. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do something, anything. But Elijah's stillness, his calm, forced the boy to obey without a word.
He realized with a mixture of fear and awe that the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a stage, and the night was about to transform into a game of shadows, distance and precision, where every decision carried weight beyond imagination. Elijah's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his eye catching the smallest movements, the faintest glimmer. He knew the distance, the wind, the slight rise of the terrain. He had anticipated their paths, counted the spacing between riders, and considered each possible reaction. Each breath was calculated, each heartbeat was measured. He was preparing not just to defend himself, but to turn the night into a lesson for men who believed they could chase him down and erase a life built from skill, survival and hard-won patience. A distant murmur of voices reached his ear, closer now, deliberate. The riders were splitting into groups, one pair moving along the creek, another circling behind the ridge. Elijah's mind raced, tracing every possibility, every trap, every path they could use. He adjusted the rifle again, checking angles, ensuring visibility through the scope without exposing himself. The boy's eyes were wide, his body frozen, but even he could sense the tension, the invisible lines being drawn in the shadows, the inevitability of the confrontation that was approaching faster than anyone dared admit. Elijah whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "They don't know patience. They don't know precision. They're about to learn." A branch snapped outside, sharper than before,
and every muscle in Elijah's body responded instantly. The rifle was up, sight aligned, trigger finger ready. Shadows shifted beyond the clearing. 1, 2, 3 figures testing the edge of the tree line, unaware that every step, every breath, every move had been predicted, measured, and prepared for. The boy pressed himself closer to the wall, silent and terrified, while Elijah remained steady, unflinching, the calm center around which the storm was about to break, the eye of an approaching chaos that he was ready to meet head-on.
The first sound of a horse's hoof striking the dirt path sent a ripple through the cabin, though Elijah's body remained unmoved. He barely flinched, his hand resting lightly on the rifle, the familiar weight grounding him as the vibrations from the earth whispered through the wooden floorboards. Outside, the shadows shifted again, now heavier, more deliberate, the faint gleam of metal catching what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Elijah's eyes traced the faint movements with precision, every instinct honed by years of skirmishes, ambushes, and the lonely stretches of war where survival depended on being faster, smarter, and quieter than everyone else. The boy crouched behind him, lips pressed tight, arms trembling, unsure whether to move, speak, or breathe. Elijah didn't offer guidance. He didn't need to. The boy could sense the tension, the weight of calculation that filled the air like thick smoke. Elijah adjusted the scope, leaning lightly over the windowsill, sighting the faint shapes slipping among the trees. There were 27. He calculated instantly, just as the boy had said, though Elijah could sense that the count wasn't exact. There were variables, shadows hiding other figures, men spreading into the periphery. Every movement mattered. Every footfall could reveal position. Every whisper of fabric, leather, or hoof could signal intent. He traced the first of the men approaching along the creek, noting the slow, careful way they navigated roots and rocks, trying not to make sound but leaving enough evidence that a trained eye would read it like a map. The rifle rested against his shoulder as he tracked the line of shadows, adjusting for angle, wind, and distance, his breathing controlled so precisely that it seemed to carry no sound at all. The boy's voice barely rose above a whisper, though it trembled with fear. "Sir, if they see us, will they come in here?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he observed, studied, and calculated. The man outside, the rider along the ridge, the shadows slipping behind a tree. Every one of them had revealed more about their intent than words ever could. "They'll test the edges first," he said finally, his tone even, almost casual, though the undercurrent of authority and experience ran through every syllable. "Men like this don't rush blindly. They circle, probe, measure until they believe they know where you are. That's when mistakes happen. And mistakes," he added, tightening his grip on the rifle, "are costly." The boy shivered. Costly for them, or for us? Elijah's eyes didn't waver from the line of approaching figures. "Both," he said quietly. "Both, if they're foolish enough to underestimate the man they hunt." His words hung in the cabin like smoke, filling the space without easing the tension. The boy felt his throat tighten, knowing that he was witnessing the calm before a storm, the quiet preparation of a predator who didn't fear the chase because he had been the hunted too many times to count, and had always emerged alive. Outside, the horses shifted. A distant voice, low and guttural, whispered commands, barely audible but enough for Elijah to interpret intent. They were splitting, dividing into smaller groups, some taking positions along the ridge, some creeping closer along the creek. Their coordination was precise, but it was also predictable. Patterns repeating from his memory of ambushes during the war. He leaned slightly closer, eyeing the first two riders attempting to close in through the shadow. He could see the tension in their posture, the uncertainty in the way they moved. They thought they were unseen. They thought they were clever. Elijah adjusted his stance, moving slowly back from the window to avoid being silhouetted, and placed the rifle on the support he had set up earlier. The weight of the weapon felt natural, almost like an extension of his own arm, and he could feel the balance shift slightly as he adjusted for the slope of the ground outside. Every calculation mattered: distance, wind, angle, cover, reaction time. Every second counted. He could hear the boy's shallow breathing behind him, could feel the tension radiating from the younger man, but he didn't flinch. He had trained himself to move calmly, to measure, to wait for the perfect moment when a single action could dictate the outcome of the night. The first rider ventured a step closer to the edge of the clearing. Elijah's eyes followed, noting the alignment of the horse, the faint glint of leather, the shifting weight of the man in the saddle. He adjusted the scope, breathing slowly, controlling every movement so precisely that the rifle seemed almost a part of the cabin itself. He could feel the history of it, the years of practice, the countless targets that had disappeared into the distance with one pull of the trigger. It was more than a weapon. It was an instrument of survival, honed and perfected over decades. The boy whispered again. What if they come together?" Elijah's response was measured, deliberate. Then they'll need patience, precision, and preparation. Numbers only matter if they can control the variables. They can't control this night. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied the shadows. And the moment they believe they can act, that's when they become predictable. A rustle of leaves, faint but deliberate, made Elijah tilt the rifle slightly. One of the riders had shifted, testing the periphery, unaware that his movement had already been accounted for in every calculation Elijah had made. He didn't move his finger yet. He didn't need to. The first shot would be precise, deliberate, controlled. One mistake, one premature pull, could give the others a chance to regroup. He had survived too long by waiting for perfection, by relying on skill, timing and patience, rather than impulse. The boy's eyes were wide, fixed on the rifle, on Elijah's steady posture, on the calm intensity that seemed to radiate from every motion. He felt his own heart racing, each beat echoing the tension outside. He realized that the night would not be like any other, that they were standing at the edge of a confrontation that would test every instinct Elijah had ever honed, every calculation he had ever made, and every ounce of patience the younger man could summon simply by watching. The first shadow moved closer to the clearing. Elijah adjusted his scope one last time, checking the faint glimmer of metal, the subtle shift in posture, the way the moonlight struck the horse's flank. He could feel the tension in the cabin tighten, could hear the boy's barely contained tremor behind him. Outside, the group was moving into position, silent, careful, confident. They were on the verge of capturing a man they thought vulnerable. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe faster. His entire being focused on one thing, the perfect moment, the precise calculation, the action that would turn fear into control, chaos into order, and the hunters into the hunted. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of earth and horse sweat into the cabin. Elijah adjusted the rifle slightly, aligning the crosshairs with the first target he had tracked from the edge of the shadows. The boy pressed himself against the wall, trying to steady his own breathing, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation settle like stone in his chest. Elijah's finger hovered near the trigger, his eyes scanning every subtle movement, every flicker, every shadow. The first shot would set the tone, define the night and change everything, and he could feel the rhythm of it building like the steady tick of a clock, counting down to the moment when action and precision would converge. Elijah moved silently to the far window, his body a shadow among shadows, the rifle resting steady against his shoulder. Outside, the Nightriders had closed the circle, their confidence now bordering on arrogance, unaware that the man they hunted was already 3 steps ahead. The moonlight glinted off their weapons, but he knew their movements, their rhythm, their mistakes before they even made them. Every sound, every creak, every whisper carried information he had learned to read like a book. The first rider stepped into the clearing, confident, unaware, and immediately a thin silver line of light caught the scope. Elijah's finger tightened slightly, but he didn't fire yet. Patience was the deadliest weapon he possessed. Another figure broke through the tree line, and a subtle shift in the wind carried the faint scent of earth and fear. The boy pressed himself further against the wall, heart pounding, sensing the inevitability of what was about to unfold, and yet rooted to the spot by awe. Then it began. The first shot rang out precise, a whisper of death that dropped a man where he stood, his horse stumbling backward. Chaos erupted instantly among the rest, their practiced formation collapsing as confusion and fear took hold. The second shot followed, then the third, each one deliberate, controlled, eliminating threat after threat before they could even Elijah moved with fluid precision, almost like a phantom, disappearing into shadows, reappearing where advantage demanded, each action dictating the pace of the night. The remaining riders scrambled, shouting, trying to regroup, but the calculated trap he had prepared months ago unfolded perfectly. Fallen logs slowed their advance, hidden obstacles tripped them, and the careful layout of the cabin's interior forced them into bottlenecks where one precise shot could neutralize multiple threats. By the time the first hints of panic reached them, it was already too late. Every movement they had counted on to secure him had become their undoing. The boy, watching from the corner, could barely comprehend what he was seeing. A man alone against 27, turning the hunters into prey, striking with an accuracy that seemed impossible. Each figure that moved into the moonlight was met with swift, calculated consequence, until only a few remained, panicked, disoriented, and unsure of where safety lay. Elijah's voice, low and commanding, echoed just enough to remind them that the master of this night had been waiting, watching and surviving for far longer than they had ever imagined. By the time the last of the Nightriders tried to flee, Elijah was already repositioned, rifle raised, every breath and heartbeat perfectly synchronized with the environment. One final shot, precise as a surgeon's scalpel,
ensured that none would escape to threaten another soul again. The night fell silent once more, broken only by the boy's shaky exhale and the distant rustle of leaves settling after the storm. Elijah lowered the rifle, eyes scanning the surrounding forest one final time. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed within. The cabin, once a sanctuary of fear and uncertainty, now stood as a fortress of survival, testament to the skill, patience and unwavering resolve of the man within. He turned to the boy, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, conveying calm without word. The boy realized in that moment what true mastery meant, not power alone but precision, patience, and the courage to act when all odds seemed insurmountable. Outside, the first rays of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the clearing in muted gold. The Nightriders were gone, either fallen or scattered, and the echoes of their menace faded with the wind. Elijah cleaned the rifle methodically, a silent ritual that honored both the danger he had faced and the lives spared. The boy helped as best he could, but every movement was careful, reverent, aware that they had witnessed something beyond ordinary comprehension. Finally, Elijah stepped outside, the morning air brushing against his face, the weight of the night lifted but not forgot. He looked over the land he had protected, his cabin, and the small clearing that had become a battlefield and a proving ground. He knew there would be more nights, more threats, more men who underestimated him. But for now, he had turned the tide once again. The Union's most decorated sniper, a man who had survived wars, hunts, and the dark impulses of men, had proven that courage, skill and relentless precision were more lethal than numbers, more enduring than fear, and more powerful than legend itself. The boy stood beside him, finally able to breathe fully, understanding that he had been part of witnessing a story that would be remembered, not just for the skill, but for the resolve of a man who refused to bow, who refused to surrender, and who, even alone, had turned 27 into a lesson that would echo for generations. Elijah's gaze swept the horizon once more, unflinching, unwavering, the quiet sentinel of a world that had underestimated him, and would never do so again.